right, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming today. More screen time, but that's how it is these days. Yeah, I think we start with introductions, and the presenters today are myself, John Lund, there's Ray, and there's Kaylee. And so I guess I'll start with introductions. My name is Shalom Kusanugraha, pronouns are Hide. I graduated very recently from UM's Environmental Philosophy MA, and I am now an MDiv student at Union Theological Seminary, but we're online, so I'm still in Montana. I'm actually right across the street from the university. Yeah, that's about me, and I will give it over to John.
Hi, my name's John Lund. I am a Lutheran pastor, and pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm serve as the director or the pastor for Emmaus Campus Ministry, which is right across from campus. And I would say we're kind of a conglomeration of liberal Protestant groups and students, and talk about a lot of the hard issues and issues of justice and inclusivity and building community in our world. Go ahead, Ray.
My name is Ray, he, him, his. I am of German and Native American derivation. The Native American side of me is from the Killer Whale clan of the Tsimshian people, whose homeland is between the Nass and Skeena rivers in British Columbia. 800 of my people migrated to Metlakatla, Alaska, and that's actually where my father was born. I'm a veteran of 2 military services, 2 federal law enforcement agencies, and just getting involved in some decolonizing work with John Lund and some organizing work with Common Good Missoula. And Kaylee, off to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Kaylee Inez. I am an MDiv student at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary in Berkeley, California, but I currently reside here in Missoula, Montana, working with John Lund at Emmaus Campus Ministry and at Atonement Lutheran Church as an intern pastor.
Excellent. And I think, Ray, you would like to start with a land acknowledgement, if you will.
As we typically do in Native communities when we meet like this, we like to acknowledge that we're meeting on stolen lands of the Salish, the Kalispel, the Blackfeet, among other nations, and like to acknowledge their long time stewardship and knowledge of this land, and further acknowledge that we could learn a lot from these peoples in furthering the stewardship of this land and from their knowledge of it.
Great. Thanks, Ray. I'm going to open up with a couple of housekeeping things, and then we can begin the session. We have slides. There will be a presentation, and after every slide, there will be a space for y'all to ask questions. So if you would send questions, and then we can open up every time after each slide if they're topical, that'd be great. Anything else? That's kind of it. Of course, this is fairly casual. I guess if you have to leave, you can leave. No pressure to turn on videos. It's nice to see people's faces, but some people aren't comfortable. So that's okay. Yeah, a brief word as to the scope of our presentation. It is limited to U.S. contemporary Christianity and certain themes that come up there. So that is sort of the limitation here. We're not speaking on behalf of global Christianity or a lot of the history. We can discuss that, of course, if it comes up and it's relevant, but for this workshop, it is U.S. Christianity and mostly contemporary, but contemporary being like a couple centuries. So, all right, that's about it. I think I'll hand it over to Ray now to open us up with this.
Hey, John, I lost the screen share. I don't have any screen at all.
I don't know about that. Are people able to see the screen? Is anybody else?
Mine is good.
I can see it.
Okay.
Okay, then I'll go with audio.
Or if you can flip back and forth between the screens, sometimes the screen is to the right or to the left, that's possible.
Thank you.
Ray, you want to jump in?
Yes, sir. So the current state of affairs here on Mother Earth, we're dealing with a climate change emergency. That's pretty well acknowledged by 97% of the scientific community. We're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction of species since the beginning of mankind. And we're in a situation where we're basically extracting and exploiting Mother Earth for all of her natural resources, leaving behind a legacy of pollution worldwide, which has a lot of negative effects that we're trying to figure out a way to deal with. Of course, colonization after the papal bulls of 1493, the European continent basically reached out and dominated the entire world pretty much through a colonization and empire grab, which gave them power over the land, and land was turned into a commodity as opposed to something we are a part of and that we should steward. And also exhibited itself in power over third world peoples, indigenous peoples, poor peoples, peoples on the margins worldwide. So that's kind of summed up of where we sit right now.
And so with the start of our presentation, our workshop here, we wanted to ask this question of how has Western Christianity enabled our current situation? And if people are comfortable answering that question or pondering out loud with us, we would like to offer just a brief moment to give an answer in a word or two, either out loud or in the chat.
I believe the chat is disabled for the participants because like I'll go to the two like who I'm addressing it to, and there's only the names of the hosts and the co-hosts.
Yes, you can send it to the co-host that says send questions here, and they will pass it on. Or you can obviously use your mic to share that information as well.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
I guess I would say like manifest destiny.
Yeah, manifest destiny.
Control.
Control, yeah.
Could you actually repeat the question?
Yeah, so we're asking this question of how has Western Christianity enabled our current situation?
Enabled, okay.
Just offer just a few more seconds here. If anybody else wants to jump in, otherwise keep that question in the back of your mind.
So in this sense, what is the situation? What are we referring to as like where is here? What is the situation?
Yeah, so when we ask that, we're coming out of the current state of affairs. How has Western Christianity enabled our current situation of climate change, mass extinction?
Ray was referring to, okay.
Yeah.
Perfect, okay, thank you.
I got 3 answers here. The first one is drive for conversion at all costs. The next one is through white saviors. And the last one is perpetuation of a nature-culture dualism.
Yes.
Wow, great musings and thinking already on this question. This question of how did we get here, how has Western Christianity enabled this current situation is the main focus of where we're coming out of today with our workshop. And so we're here to kind of attempt to bring to light how Western Christianity has enforced, enabled, supported, and even maybe led to where we are today in our world.
So and we just want to acknowledge that this is not all easy to hear if you identify as Christian, and this might be some it might be challenging, and we're inviting ourselves to kind of wrestle with that, and just want to acknowledge that this isn't necessarily easy, but hopefully will be helpful as we go through it. One of the things that we've inherited as a dominant paradigm of Western Christianity is these dualisms and hierarchy. And the hierarchy is, we kind of have this view, like if you ask anybody, where's God? They almost always point up, like way up. So we always have God up high, and with God might be Jesus and angels. And then along the hierarchy, we have men, and in our country, we'd have white people, and so we have hierarchy based on wealth, on race, on cisgender, on orientation. Women are below men still in our culture, or what we've inherited, and then below the people are the creatures and the earth itself, and then if you go all the way down, and you said, where's the devil? The devil's down there. It's a straight line from the top to the bottom, and we're all somewhere on that line. And then you layer that in with a patriarchal worldview. If we think of God as the father and the man of the head of the household, and the men are going to be closer to God than the women and the other creatures. And then this kind of a God typically is also like this omnipotent, all-powerful, judgmental with punitive powers. And there's this split, this dualistic, somebody had mentioned the dualisms, the split between the spiritual and the earthly realms, right? So the spiritual realm is good, but it's not here, it's out there. And then the earthly realm, which is our bodies and the wild things and the creatures and the earth, is not spiritual, is bad. And so we have these separations, and this drive between God and humanity, God and the earth, and even humanity and the rest of the creatures. And so that's one layer that seems to be problematic for us as we think about these things. Any questions or comments on that one? We have about 4 of these we're going to go through, so. Okay, we can always come back.
Another added layer into this dominant paradigm of Western Christianity comes out of this sense of individualism, of individual salvation, where it's more about I and me instead of we and a community. So we get this narrative that is concerned with, are you saved? And that we need to have our children baptized because that way we know that they will be saved. And so this narrative continues in saying that what am I doing? What am I personally doing to ensure that I get to heaven? How am I stacking myself up so God will let me into those pearly gates when the time comes? And this impacts Western Christianity's view on the land, because in the same vein, that narrative is saying, in the end, we all die and we won't be on this earth anymore. We'll be somewhere away, either heaven or hell. So why do we even care about the land or the earth when we're just eventually going to leave it? Right? Because it's about me and my life until I die. And so our salvation becomes individualized, and it becomes more about, how is my relationship with God and Jesus? Is it strong enough to survive the end times, the rapture, so I can get into heaven? And so our narrative, or the dominant paradigm narrative, focuses on our personal morality rather than this communal responsibility. And we also, out of this narrative, get the idea of substitutionary atonement, that Jesus had to die for our sin, that it was God's will and God's desire for Jesus to die so Jesus could suffer and pay the price of my sins. And thus, because that happened, all Christians are saved. And if you're not Christian, or you're not Christian enough, good luck is kind of what comes out of this narrative, right? Yeah, do we have questions or thoughts there on individual salvation?
Maybe to connect, Kaylee, with what you're saying as well, is that this notion of individual salvation, right? And then like you're only saved if it's if you come to Christianity. That is, someone else mentioned earlier on that like this drive to convert, right? I think that does come from there a little bit. The conversion in this sort of very brutal and very forceful way, on the guise of having everybody come to their individual salvations as opposed to like a communal aspect of things.
Ready to move on? Maybe.
I actually just got a question here. It says, this is a big question, but can you add some clarity about how this paradigm has been upheld, whether in scripture or institutions?
Can we go back to the slide, John? The previous one.
John, can you back up the slides?
I'm not
So we
sure
have a
who can
reference
hear us.
before we answer. Uh-oh. Okay, well. Right, so when we're talking about so how this is upheld, right? There's a lot of history that we can point to in some ways. There is this notion of the Protestant ethic, right, where you have to work, and then salvation is you work for your work, and then like if you're blessed, that's the proof of your faith in God, right? And so that is something that's very individual. It's sort of what fed in a lot of ways, especially in America, is what fed sort of the growth of Christianity. Is this notion that you work, and out of your individual work, you know, God will bless you. That kind of thing is very individualized, right? And that is coming out of a particular historical and cultural framework that is Europe to America, the Reformation and whatnot. So it comes from there as well, and that is a certain interpretation, right, of scripture that has been passed on throughout the generations, through multiple iterations. So that's one way we can say that the individual salvation bit has been very much expressed. I think there are other ways too in a lot of, I'm from Indonesia, so my coming to America is, I'm looking at it in comparison to a lot of Indonesian, from an Indonesian lens. And it is interesting when I do look at American churches, a lot of the focus is, yeah, personal salvation, right? Not that personal salvation is not important or a part of the gospel, but there's this overwhelming sense in which what is important is your relationship to Jesus, right? And that is sort of what is focused on, as opposed to, say, how do we bring about societal transformation for all, right? That is actually part of another tradition in America. There is something called the social gospel, but overwhelmingly, it seems like the mainstream interpretation, not all churches, I would say, but there is this distinct sense that it's like, how am I doing with Jesus, right? And then the assumption there is that however well you do with Jesus, right, that is what's going to flow out in your character. So that is sort of the logic behind it. It's still very individual, right? Which is in contrast to a lot of other ways of thinking about it, where it's more, okay, how do we ensure sort of social, not safety, yeah, how do we ensure sort of social and communal well-being such that everybody can, you know, have this sort of, salvation is an interesting one, but it is sort of a notion of communal salvation. So I will say that. Anybody else have anything? Because that I can go on and ramble on that. But
we did get another question if no one has anything to add for that last question. This question is, how does this approach reflect the question, what is God? If the world was created by God, isn't it an extension of God?
We're going to get to that a little bit later. Maybe we could just hold that question. It's one of our slides as we move on. Let's go to our next. My slideshow is jamming up. Hold on a second. Come on, there it is. Shalom.
Yeah, all right. Constant topic in environmental philosophy, if anybody's kind of go somewhere in those realms, is anthropocentrism, but in this case, from a theological lens. So the dominant paradigm of Western Christianity has this notion of human exceptionalism, right? Where humans are the pinnacle of God's creation. He's been very good, for example, as the translations of some Genesis stories have it. And that creation is there for us to use, to consume, sort of like nature has value in a sense as much as it has value for humans, right? So that is something that is definitely a thread in some Christian theologies, and a lot of ways implicitly in how a lot of us think about how to approach nature. So the anthropocentrism just means that humans are at the center, right? So anthropocentric, and it's all considered that. This is kind of manifested at times in the prosperity gospel, right? Where the focus is on humans and human well-being. If we're faithful, God will bless us with health, wealth, and pursuit of happiness. There's not really any regard in a lot of ways as to the well-being of others, especially other beings. The prosperity is about humans, right? It's about like our prosperity, not like the earth's prosperity, not about social prosperity. It's a very sort of limited, narrow sense of prosperity. And you can see that in sort of if you're familiar with prosperity gospels. It is an interesting phenomenon. I don't want to say that it doesn't touch on something that people need, or some sort of deep sort of psychological sort of desire that people have, but it is often based on this sort of narrow interpretation of what being blessed means, right? And it's very human-centric. And in a lot of dominant theologies, humans are the only ones with a soul. We see this a lot coming out of medieval times and even Greek philosophy as well. The humans are the only ones with a soul, so other creatures don't matter as much. Sometimes this is rationalized as, ironically, that humans are the ones that are rational, and rational belies the soul, right? So since humans are the only ones who are rational, then humans are the ones with a soul. And this also goes into domination of a lot of other beings, if you say that. For example, women were considered non-rational for a long time, and that was justified domination of. So it's connected to that. And there's also other instances of, who counts as a full human. If they're not full human, you can definitely dominate, etc. Like 3/5 of a human or not human, closer to nature. That's actually, not to ramble a bit, but the charts say, okay. Is this better? Sometimes I'm getting feedback that my mic is not great.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of static, Shalom.
Okay. Well, that's unfortunate. Okay, I can try do this for the rest of it. I'll just say that. Should I go over again, or should I just move on?
Let's keep going.
Okay. So humans are the only soul that's like spent in a lot of ways that is the basis of a lot of subjugation. And then there's this idea even that when we have a notion of stewardship, but if it's anthropocentric stewardship, it still centers around the human, right? So there's this, we can have this understanding of God creating all life and that it's good and that we are the pinnacle and that therefore we must be responsible, right? We have some obligation to take care of creation, but of course the priority is still us. We are the ones charged with this special role to take care of creation. And while that sounds a lot better than just domination and using nature, just utilizing it like it's expendable, this sort of thinking still posits the human being at the center, right? That humans are special and have the power and therefore must take care, which still has this notion of anthropocentrism well within it. So this is another form of theology that centers the human. Okay, does anybody have any questions? I can clarify some things that people maybe couldn't hear. Hopefully, now that I'm holding up this mic, it's a little better.
Okay, we're gonna go to the next slide. And as questions come, we still can come back to it. And Ray?
So as relates to the dominant paradigm of Western Christianity, talking about colonialism, it was brought up in the earlier broader question, the term manifest destiny. So here we are. This actually started with what's known as the doctrine of discovery. Pope Alexander VI, I believe, in 1493, so right after Columbus allegedly discovered the New World, basically gave carte blanche to any and all European explorers to lay claim to any lands west of a line, a north-south line through the Azore Islands, 100 leagues west of that. So it was a very arbitrary line. But basically he was referring to North and South America, which Columbus had touched upon. He said, if you have carte blanche to plant your flag for your king or queen and claim those lands, if there are no Christian kings there already, if the people are not Christianized, either convert them or get rid of them, get them out of the way. So already it's been set up that the native, indigenous, aboriginal people around the world, in this case North America, were less than human. So they were ripe for the taking. They were to be dominated and to be done away with. And in that whole process, as we got further down the line in North America, manifest destiny came into play. And that was basically a phrase that was coined by a newspaper editor named of Sullivan that basically attributed the God-given right of this nation to take for themselves the entire continent and to do with it as they saw fit, to put it to good use. Because part of this narrative involves, well, those lands are just being wasted by those non-humans anyway, so wasted land is ours for the taking. That comes under John Locke's theory of personal property as well. And this kind of echoes the promised land theory from the Exodus story. This narrative was basically used to dehumanize and decimate hundreds of indigenous tribes. There were 500 plus nations already present on the North American continent when Columbus, again, allegedly discovered it. And tens of millions of people. It's hard to really determine the exact numbers, but I've seen numbers as high as 60 million native inhabitants of North and South America at the time of Columbus. 60 million. And that number at the turn of the 20th century, at least in North America, was less than 300,000 people. So when you do the math, that is a very efficient job of racist genocide by the European powers on the North American continent. In addition, these narratives allowed Europeans to enslave literally millions of Black Africans to do their work for them. The numbers vary between 9 and 15 million. 10 or 12 seems to be the sweet spot that most people agree upon. But suffice it to say, 10 million lives and families were disrupted so that European colonizers could use their slave labor to enrich themselves. And keep in mind, all of this was accomplished on stolen lands. So if you want to really get right down to it, if you're not a Native American, you are you are really an illegal immigrant on this continent. And this continent was logged, it was mined, it was cultivated. And even when the natives were placed on their small amount of land that's still left to them today on their reservations, even at that point when the land was allotted, if there were not enough adult males to grab their allotment of land, even that small portion of reservation land then was opened up under the Dawes Act for anybody to come and buy land for pennies on the dollar, really. So you see a lot of times on reservations today, you'll see a checkerboard pattern of ownership where it should be 100% Native American. It is, I believe the Blackfeet Reservation is 56% Native and the rest non-Native. So this is a sad history of exploitation, and it was all done. It started with the Pope writing a papal bull, which is an edict. So the church is complicit to this very day in all of this activity. As recently as 2005 even, Ruth Bader Ginsburg used the doctrine of discovery, believe it or not, in ruling against the Oneida tribe in upstate New York, referenced their lands, their right to their lands. They were actually their traditional homelands, which they had bought back from white people, from colonizers. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote the majority decision from the Supreme Court saying, you guys waited too long to reclaim these lands, so sorry, you're out of luck. Questions on these issues?
That's a heavy load. It's a heavy load to sink in. It's important we carry that load.
And I would just add, John, on this subject in general, what is generally taught in K through 12 in this country is the American mythology. What I've just put forth to you is actually closer to the true history of what went on. The information's there, but you have to dig for it. You're probably not going to get the full extent of the story in K through 12 education in this country. And there are even active efforts ongoing in Texas and Oklahoma for sure, on a yearly basis to even rewrite and even more make it the guys with the white hats story, the mythology, as opposed to history. That's an ongoing thing. And of course, you probably have heard that President Trump has a 1776 initiative where he's pushing this point very hard. He doesn't want white people's feelings to be hurt. He wants the mythology to dominate as opposed to the history, which might hurt some people's feelings.
Okay, thank you, Ray. We're gonna pivot at this point and look at what are also, we might call, alternative perspectives, other ways of thinking about our relationship to land and to the sacred, primarily through the Christian lens. Ray's gonna talk here on this next slide, not representing everybody, of course, but just it's kind of some general thoughts about indigenous relationships to land. Go ahead, Ray.
Well, in my view, and basically in my people's view, we come from a standpoint of stewardship of the earth. So there's two creation stories in the Bible, one of stewardship and one of dominion and subduing. And we were the original hunter-gatherers. We're the original environmentalists. We see things as, we as humans are not above, but we are equal with all of the other living things in the Creator's creation, to include even a rock or a stream. And as such, we should not abuse other animals, other living things. We should honor their presence and take care of them and take care of their landscapes and their grazing areas and where they normally roam. We're here to take care of things, not to abuse, not to get every last inch of timber out of the forest or dam the river and use all of the water to flush out some mine and pollute the river. We're here just to get along and be part of the creation, not the subduer of it, not the dominator of it. And in terms of that, in the Indian way of thinking, you don't own land, you just take care of it. So that was a narrative that was pushed upon Native Americans as well, to break their tribal authority, is to make them good Christian landowners, as opposed to a communal stewardship of their traditional lands. Just another way to break down things.
I would like to loop with what you just said with a few words that were said previously, to note that Montana is different, I think, than all the other states in the United States. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, in that in its constitution, it mandates Indian education for all in K-12, and that it is integrated in the curriculum, some places better than others, through legislature of Montana, principally white dominant culture, to have Indian education for all accessible in the K-12, integrated in the K-12 and college curricula.
And I'm very glad you brought up the point. You're exactly right. It is in the Constitution. But just because it's in black and white doesn't mean it happens. And here's why I say that. In some of the work that John and I have been doing with different groups, and a lot of the folks are young folks, so I'll go around the room and I'll say, so what did you learn about Native Americans in your K through 12 years? And with very few exceptions, I can only think of one was very well informed, but I think that was mostly on her own volition. Basically, the answers I got were, yeah, not much, or I don't remember anything, or yeah, they didn't do much. So it's kind of, there's no set curriculum, I don't believe, that you will teach A, B, and C. It's kind of left up to the teachers and their own devices. And if the teacher is either incapable of or doesn't want to teach that, then you have what you have. So it is in the Constitution, but whether it gets done or not, that's a different matter. And hopefully in your case, maybe you know people that have been properly educated and want to reach out with further questions and further studies. But my limited experience so far has been, yeah, we didn't learn much.
All right, thank you, Ray. We'll keep looking, and our next slide here. We're gonna just kind of go back to the Jesus story and maybe some of the key points. Was that my slide, or we're gonna say yes? Okay.
I think so.
So just very briefly, when we think about the Jesus story, we have to remember that he came out of a peasant class of people in a relatively small tribe at the time, and who were under Roman occupation, and you know, you're kind of under the thumb of the Roman Empire in so many different ways, in terms of movements and actions and taxes and possibilities, and that there were a lot of calls for revolution, that the Jewish people at that time were hoping, there was at least some of the people that were hoping that they could kind of raise up a revolution against the Romans and throw them out. And so there was a call for like revolutionary power. And so some people thought Jesus might be that person that could really go after it. So you're kind of in between, right? Revolutionaries and empire around you. And out of that, then this primary command is to love your neighbor no matter what, and even love your neighbor that looks different than you, or has a different God, or a different, you know, rules, or different culture, and even your enemy, you know. So this radical love of the other, and that the kind of the greatest commandment is around like, be compassionate as God is compassionate to you. And compassion is the root word for womb. So to like to try to understand the other as if they were in your womb. It's a very feminine word, but to try to understand the other in that kind of deep relational way. And then to flip around to say, blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are those who seek justice. And that's, and not to say that those things are blessings, but to say that they're not like cursed because of those, or that God has abandoned them because of those things when those happen in their lives. And so it's kind of lifting up people in these spaces that are in pain in different ways. And this stewardship model, like the last shall be first and the first shall be last. So flipping around even how we understand power, and that there's not Jew nor Greek, nor slave nor free, nor male nor female, that there's this like equaling out of all, and this vision of the beloved community with this deep kinship of all people and all life, where all are fed and have dignity and are blessed. And those are the kind of the core messages of what Jesus is trying to do within his social and historical context of empire and calls for revolution. That's a simplistic shot, but we're just trying to kind of bump through this. Any questions there? Okay, Kaylee.
So as we continue to look at alternative voices of an emerging worldview, we just had 3 kind of key points before we start looking at more theology. And so we're looking at this shift of an integrated model of God. And so we're looking to understand that the sacredness of non-human life and non-Christian humans, right? We want to switch the dominant paradigm narrative that humans are the most important of creation and look more towards the sacredness of non-human life, of all of creation. And that would give us the ability to mourn with the oppressed and mourn over the systems of dominion and injustice set upon us by society. And so that would look towards a God who works through love and spirit to be an agent of just relationships. And then we would look at another point would be that Christianity is never understood as an individual relationship with God. And so moving again out of that individualism of the major paradigm and moving towards a communal view and being in community with one another for a better sense of personal peace and joy. And so that would move the experience from me and myself to an experience of our culture, our current social, political, and historical context. It would look more globally than individually. And so that would include the gospel stories as being this longer story of prophetic voices, right? That the gospels didn't end after the writers finished them, but we're still working on those gospels today within our society and in our context. And that kind of shows that Jesus's acts were always significant in relation to the social and political norms of his time. And then our third point is that the redemption is redefined as non-violent healing. Because as we heard in the dominant paradigm, right, that substitutionary atonement, that Jesus had to die, Jesus had to suffer, kind of comes over into the dominant paradigm as, well, I need to suffer, I need to bear the cross. And so we're wanting to change that voice and say that non-violent healing, right, that redemption, we redefine redemption through non-violent terms. And so that would look at our communities and systems in place and the structural evils that are within our government that are designed to oppress and marginalize people who are poor, people who are Black or brown, people who are immigrants, right? So we'd want to break down those systems of oppression, those systems of structural sin, so we can better have a sense of wholeness and right relationships within our society and ecological systems. So those are the three kind of key points for our alternative voices.
Any questions? Oh, right. And just, you know, in terms of those 3 points we've outlined just before, also, is my mic working better now? Great, okay. I think I fixed it. Yes. Healing, right? Redemption. My mic has been redeemed. Those 3 points are grounded in a return to the Jesus story, right? And it's sort of a way to come back to the radical roots of Christianity, whereas a lot of the dominant paradigm that we've discussed prior to, well, yeah, the story we've been telling about the dominant paradigm, a lot of the stuff that gets imported into the dominant paradigm comes about through this really long historical period, right? And so all this stuff that we're talking about in terms of an alternative view, they are alternative, but they're not exactly new. You know, they have their roots back in the Jesus story. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about these two theologies that have been recently articulated that have kind of looked back to the roots of Christianity, the early church, and particularly the gospel stories. And they found something there that challenges a lot of dominant paradigms. So liberation theology, and a lot of people cite, if you want to know more, Father Gutierrez as the one who really kind of brought it to the fore, though there are also really prominent figures that came after him. For Black liberation theology, for example, you do have James Cone, and there's a lot of other people and various other ones right now for various parts of the world. But so what liberation theology sees is that back in the Jesus story, right, in this context of empire, Jesus's actions were challenging, right? They challenged this sort of empire, the social and political context of the time that had rendered the Jewish people, Jesus as a Jew, then in this position that they were discriminated against, right? And there's a lot of oppression there for various reasons. So liberation theology looks at that moment and sees that, you know, in the figure of Jesus, in sort of, yeah, in the figure of Jesus, that God is aligning with the oppressed, right? People who are under domination. And that there is a sort of, the term is preferential treatment, or well, preferential, yeah, alignment with the poor and the marginalized against systems that have harmed them. So that is what liberation theology sees, and the liberation from those systems, right, is what becomes the core focus. And so the highlight is Jesus' social and political challenges to the system, whatever it is, right? It could be economic, political, military. And so there's a lot of emphasis there on social coming together, political coming together, and also material coming together to really change people's lives, right? So that is liberation theology. And it comes from that. Feminist theology, you know, it focuses on the lived experiences and wisdom of everyone, all genders, and from all social positions, social locations. And it sort of rejects this understanding that God is coming out of a patriarchal and hierarchical system of power, and also is really fighting against the fact that if you ignore the lived experience and if you privilege a certain understanding of the human, as before slightly mentioned, as rational, if you have this typical ideal of human, right? This ideal human being, usually white male, that you're missing a lot of the wisdom that other people bring in who are not from that social location, right? So they take the standpoint of, it's really important that we look at the lived experiences of people all around, and that, you know, this is actually what Jesus did in sort of the gospel stories and sort of the way he related with people who are otherwise thought of as unclean, as outside. You know, Jesus fraternized with prostitutes, with people with diseases, with tax collectors that were very much, even within the Jewish community, were
looked upon with scorn because they were considered agents of the empire. So Jesus was aligning and living and learning with people of different lived experiences that otherwise did not conform to the social ideal or the social sort of, you know, standard of humanity, if you will. So that is where feminist theology really takes its standpoint from. And it's really interesting how this has been taken up over time as well. And as point 3 says, all these perspectives challenges to assume dualities between gods and humans, between humans and creation. And the shift is to understand God within creation and within relationships, right, between people and within ecological systems. Because with both of these theologies, as we'll see, we developed a little bit more in the next slide, it takes sort of like, okay, so how do we then extend our moral, how do we extend moral consideration? How do we bring into moral community, other beings? And this includes creation, right? And with that, I will let it go to John.
Yeah, any questions at this point? We're throwing out a lot, I know that.
Shalom, you were well prepared.
I guess so, thank you.
Okay, we're gonna keep rolling here. Maybe. I don't know why I keep locking up, sorry. Okay. And Kaylee, is this you or is this me? Maybe me, okay. So just kind of along those same lines, another way to think about how our relationship with God works is that as that creation was not just a one-time event back at the Big Bang or wherever we think, and now God is somehow way out there or way up there or way, but thinking about God in and of the world, and this idea that all of creation has sacredness to it and in kind of God's spirit and God presence within it, that all of creation is in God, and that God, some will say, doesn't even exist without creation, that it's that this integral part of who God is, bigger than creation, but still like part of, and still engaged. And what we get in the process part is that this is like, it's ongoing, it's still happening. There's still this kind of God spirit that is calling the world into the future in a way. And so the humans have a part of this, that we, and it's not thinking of like the puppet master, or the potter necessarily. I mean, maybe the potter is an interesting, but that, is kind of a calling through prophetic voices and through dreams and through visions and through energy and love and empathy and relationship and community, that our actions actually are part of the process. That, if we are able to kind of work together and forgive each other and build community and fix a river, for instance, or save the ecology of a mountain, or stop a species from going extinct, like we have this agency is part of the future, like what's going to happen, like our actions matter. And we know that we're kind of on the verge of either like throwing our whole planet into a whole mass extinction, or we still have a restorative possibility here, and that we are kind of, God is counting on us to do something in this creation. And so there's this one term that's been used, the created co-creators, and not to say we are God, but it is to say our actions matter, and that listening to God and being called into a future of possibility in life matters a lot, and that's where we're at right now, and that Christianity could be that agent that is reminding of us of our place of responsibility and relational connection to everything else. Deep ecology and eco-theology both are extensions of that we can't separate ourselves from the rest of creation. We're not any different. That in an ecological system, if one entity separates itself, it dies, like, because it's not connected. To understand that we're intimately connected to and part of all creation, our fate, our wellness, our prosperity, our health, sustainability, the good life is only going to be in relationship to everything else. And that's our theology needs to reflect that and be part of that. And then there's various perspectives in theological dialogue that go along. There are numerous indigenous theologians that are kind of talking about indigenous worldview and relationships and spirituality and theology. Womenist, which are often come like from kind of Black liberation perspectives and feminists, but womenist perspectives. Mihurista, am I saying that? Coming out probably Latin America and South America, queer theology, giving space for people to be doing theology from different social locations within our whole culture, and lifting up and listening to different perspectives and voices. That's a critical piece of moving forward right now for us. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I'd just like to say too that I think there's a lot of theological wording here too that might be unfamiliar to people. So if people have clarification questions about just the terms, that would also be good. I would just want to open space for that, just in case people feel kind of shy about it.
I think this next slide goes back to one of the comments somebody was talking about. Kaylee?
Yeah, so this is a quote from Sally McFaig. She's a white American ecofeminist and radically changed the dominant paradigm of Western Christianity. Her work expanded and challenged traditional theology to think more deeply and more intimately on the relationships between God and the world, not just humans. And so here in her work on the universe as God's body, she's merging the dualisms of spirit and physical worlds with who God is. And so she's saying that if we think about God outside of the spiritual world and into the physical, then why would we not say that the earth is God's very body, right? So she's decentering God as human, or in human terms, and is wanting to understand God more spiritually, or more based off of the earth, right? So she has this concept that God gives life to all things. Humans only give life to human life, but God gives life to all forms. And so in that sense, she's saying that we can understand God more as the earth than we can understand God as human. And so for her, it makes the most sense to say that God's body is our earth. And if that is how we understand who God is and what God is, then how does that reshape our thinking of the earth and reshape our responsibility of living on the earth, or living on God's very being? So she's changing that narrative a bit.
Kaylee, real quick, we just got a question. It says, I appreciate the idea of moving forward, but what forms of reckoning and perhaps restitution might occur in order to center justice?
yeah, at the end of the day, you've got to get down to the actual things, right? And you know, you have to start with truth telling and honesty and deciding that you want to have just relationships and you want to have reconciliation that is, or maybe it's not reconciliation, it's just conciliation, and that the history matters and we have work to do. And if you can get to that point, then you can start talking about what, you know, I don't know if you use the word reparations or but what does justice look like? What does, is there a rearranging of resources or of wealth or of energy? I mean, those are hard questions, and dominant culture is not real excited to talk about those or to lean into that. But I think that's the deep calling. I mean, that's why Jesus gets himself in so much trouble, is because he's calling on those kinds of things. You know, so there's risk. There's a lot of risk involved, and it can be painful and it can be hard, but that's what we have to move into. Right now, we have a Black pastor in my church, the Lutheran Church, who's trying to build an endowment of $32 million to help pastors of historical Black and other people of color who were never paid or not paid hardly enough and don't have enough money for retirements and healthcare and all those things. And that, you know, for a church that really cares about people, that we need to have this kind of fund set aside for those kinds of reparations. You know, that's a small move. It doesn't feel small, 32 million. That's the conversation that's happening like right now in my denomination. So that'd be an example.
And there are some conversations on a more basic level of, there have been many treaties written on this land between various tribes and the US federal government or state government. And the treaties weren't understood in the same way by all parties signing the treaty, or maybe one signature carried 15, 30, 40, 100 people because somebody wrote the signature, and what was verbalized wasn't what was written, and what was understood wasn't what was verbalized or written. So there was a big, long time of not quite clear communication, to say the least. And all that has caused trauma upon trauma upon trauma, and distrust and miscommunication. So to really have a sense of reconciliation and healing, both parties need to come to the table, or multiple parties need to come to the table. The dominant culture needs to come to a place where everybody belongs at a round table. And it's hard given all the history based on miscommunication, intentional and non-intentional.
I certainly appreciate those comments. As the Lakota war chief Red Cloud said, the white man made us many treaties and he kept but one, or he made us many promises, I'm sorry, and he kept but one. He promised to take our land and he took it. Mm-hmm. And you're right on point with that. To the extent, even, let me take it a little bit further. You know, the predominant story is that Manhattan was bought for $24 worth of beads by the Dutch. Well, in fact, the tribes that they gave those $24 worth of beads to were not even the predominant tribe whose traditional lands those were. So that was just some random group of Indians passing through someone else's land, and the Dutch grabbed them and said, "Hey, you mind if we take this island? We'll give you some beads." Also, you're right. Treaties were often not translated. The authorities, the U.S. government authorities, often grabbed friendly Indians or random Indians and appointed them chiefs outside of the tribal authority, and said, hey, you come here, you're going to be the chief of the Nez Perce tribe and you're going to sign this treaty. Or they found chiefs that were already Christianized and they got something out of the deal. And the rest of this actually happened to Chief Joseph's tribe, the Nez Perce, over in mostly in Washington and Idaho area. They grabbed a Christianized chief and said, you're going to sign for the other 6 clans. And then everyone had to come to that chief's particular land. So none of the other clans agreed to that, but under force of military occupation, they had to abide by it, even though it was just signed by one chief. You know, in terms of coming to terms with all of this from a Native perspective, at least from my perspective, education and truth-telling might lead to some conciliation. We throw the word around reconciliation, but that implies that there was conciliation to begin with, which is not the case almost universally. And allyship, you know, care about our issues. How many of you know that there are thousands of Native women that are raped and or murdered on Indian reservations across this nation, and no one ever sees from them again, no one hears from them again, the bodies are not found, and no one is prosecuted. The cases are not even looked into. That's a case where the predominant society could become allies of the Native nations and ensure that those cases are prosecuted and investigated properly. It is a heinous situation. It's unbelievable. The reservations are known as a free zone because of interjurisdictional issues between tribal police, the county sheriff, the state police, the FBI, BLM, BIA. It is an absolute mess of jurisdiction. So it is well known among pedophiles and sexual predators, the reservation is the place to go. Because as a white man, you can go to the reservation, rape and kill a Native woman and not be prosecuted under tribal law. That falls on the white man's law. Now, that is a major loophole in the system that needs to be fixed somehow. If you're looking for opportunities to help and be allies with, not come pat us on our head and say, here you go, here's some dollars, or we're going to paint your church. Be there in a substantive way as allies to make sure some of these things that are huge, heinous loopholes get closed and have justice assigned to them.
Ray, are you familiar with the nonprofit Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women?
There are several that are named that, correct, that have used that name? Or are you speaking of one in particular?
The one that I know is called Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women.
And is that the one that went to DC and testified in front of Congress, in front of the Indian Committee?
I believe so. I might be wrong. I will have to look into it, but I mean, there are like groups who are like actively seeking like justice for these women.
Understood. Those are mostly Native people, though, in those groups, yes?
Yes, that's my understanding.
Predominantly. So what I'm asking for is allyship from the predominant culture in this country, the white culture. Hey, be aware of this issue and help us out with it. Make sure it gets prosecuted and investigated properly, so it's not an ongoing issue. The same issue is in Canada.
Just real quick, we do have about 7 minutes left, but I did get a question in the chat, so I'll just go ahead and read it. It says, how do you all contextualize contemporary Christian theology that is essentially rediscovering these principles of deep interconnectedness, which many people have understood forever, especially different indigenous worldviews and other traditions as well?
Yeah, I guess I could give it a shot. It is, you know, in thinking about Christian history, I mean, I was just in class and it struck me that the fact, it's really striking that if you, being a Christian in a dominant position is very, how do you say it? It's very it's fairly new, especially coming in an American context. Like, I guess what struck me was that, approaching it from a position of privilege, like Christians having privilege is very, it's strange, really. Yeah. And I guess the way that the early church sort of negotiated it is to actually redistribute material, right? To change the social and political system. So I don't really know how to contextualize it, because it seems to me like the fact that there are these new forms of domination today, and then the sort of new categories of race and whatnot, it is a difficult challenge. And I think that's where we need to really think about contextualizing it with. So yeah, I don't know, like the Christian history bit, maybe it doesn't really answer the question, but what struck me is that, if we've traced Christian history from the original Jesus story till now, there's so many changes. How do we sort of bridge that gap between the early story, where we are now, and then also what the question is about, right? So like, how do we connect that gap, and then where we are now, with sort of the other perspectives that have been around for a really long time that have only encountered one aspect, or like one particular version of Christianity. So there's a lot of work there, I think, that can be unpacked. But I don't know, that's also the question for me, is like, I have no clue, like it's sort of having to reckon with history while forging ahead, and maybe reviving sort of like, how do we change the actual social political systems and what we can see for community, which was the case in early church. And yeah, I don't know, anybody else has any thoughts, because I'm now just rambling.
I would just throw in that once Constantine decided that Christianity was going to be the religion of the empire in 300 something, that changed dramatically what Christianity became, and it became a tool of empire, which was also then a tool to keep people in line, a tool to justify crusades and land seizures, and it really got warped through all that. Like, how do you keep people from the common people in line through fear and trembling, and then also justify your wealth building and warmongering? It kind of became the very thing that Jesus, I think, was against in his work. So maybe there's a reclaiming, but obviously we're not going back to that time. So there's a reclaiming of values, and remembering the story, and then kind of looking at it through new eyes, and paying attention to the other stories around the world that are calling us into right relationship. I think for a lot of us, like, I'm not going to start, I can't take on a Blackfeet, like, it's not my story. I come out of European roots that have the Christian story. So, and that's true for a lot of us, that like we've got to reimagine our story. We can't just appropriate somebody else's. We just had our last slide here. I don't know, is Kaylee still on board?
I am. Do you want me to go ahead and just wrap this up?
Sure.
Okay, so kind of the end note we wanted to leave with is, as we've considered this dominant paradigm of Western Christianity and alternative voices of an emerging worldview, we want to just kind of ask the question for the church, that are we ready to really envision this emerging worldview? As Christians, we're called in a sort to be compelled to these prophetic voices of resistance to the powers of domination that include white and Western supremacy. And then we're also compelled to be a healing force of the world by preserving life and creation, lifting up the poor and oppressed and vulnerable aspects within creation and bring a vision of hope, promise, and new life. And so our question now is, are we ready for that? You know, all of that entails, it's risky, it's vulnerable, it includes admitting that Western Christianity got it wrong. We oppressed many people. We were a force of genocide at one point, right? So are we ready to really reckon with our history and our truth here in America? And then what does that look like now? What can the church be here in America?